Hello and welcome to this special episode on Herald TV. We have today with us Professor Achin Vanaik. He is a retired professor of international relations and former head of Department of Political Science at the University of Delhi. He is an active member of the Coalition for Nuclear Disarmament and Peace India and a strong voice on, if I say, pro-Palestine in India. I would straight away ask you to, describe the present war that Israel has waged against Palestine. How do you see it?
Well, the UN Secretary General, Guterres, said that you can't just look at what Hamas did as the starting point. You must recognize that this is taking place in a certain context, in a certain vacuum. So let's start by looking at that context. And here the simple point is that Israel is guilty of the longest running illegal military occupation of the 20th and 21st century, and one that has been sustained by the most brutal forms of overt and covert violence. The relationship between the Palestinians and Israel is a relationship between a colonizing power and the colonized. It's like the relationship between Britain and India when India was a colony.
So, Professor, good that you pointed out it's like a colony, but Israel's history, as the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu puts it, is not just 100 or a 200-year-old, but the Jews existed for more than 3,000 years, and therefore they have a place that is theirs, and they should be, they lawfully should be there. And the state of Palestine exists maybe a few hundred years or just 1,000 years. How do you?
Well, first of all, let's be precise. The state of Israel didn't exist for 3,000 years. The point you're making is that the Jews were one of the original inhabitants of that, maybe 3,000 years. But even here, you have to be careful. If you look at the Old Testament, for example, you'll know that there have been other tribes before that, even before the Israelites. The Israelites, or Judaism, emerges in the late Bronze Age, which means around about 1500 BC or so. But in the Old Testament, you talk about the Jebusites, you talk about the Canaanites. There's also reference to the Philistines. And even before that, there were the Amorites and the Hittites. And even before that, there were the Phoenicians and so on. That's one point. A second point is that contrary to what is often said, that Judaism is not a proselytizing religion. Where on earth did the Ashkenazi or European Jews come from? The blonde, blue-eyed Jews came from. Do you know that in the 9th century, 9th century, there was the kingdom of Kazan, which was a Jewish kingdom. And you had, of course, Jews coming from there. You have black Jews from Ethiopia. You have Arab Jews, you have all of these. So you have a whole history of people living there and people who never lived there. And Palestinians have been there for generations and generations. So this idea that, oh, this belonged to them here because of they existed in the past. Well, if you really want to go biologically, you'll probably find that Mesopotamians and all, there's probably a longer continuity with many of the Palestinians who've been there generation after generation. And in any case, we have to be very careful about this whole business of what's called an organic conception of nationalism. What that means is that they say that the nation existed long ago. Actually,
before the people.
No, the nation existed. Actually, it's nationalism that comes first and leads to the nation. So first a nationalist sentiment emerges and then pushes for a nation, which is exactly the history of the Zionist movement.
So, as you said, the idea of nationalism comes first, and
not the idea, the sentiment.
The sentiment.
The
this was perhaps a century-old idea, which then was put forth.
It came in the late 19th century. The Jewish World Congress, Zionist World Congress, was in 1897, and it came as a response to the suffering of Jews because of anti-Semitism in Russia, Tsarist Russia, and in Eastern Europe primarily. You also had a certain element of anti-Semitism in Western Europe and all, but it was much less because you were more integrated. You had very rich, wealthy Jews who were assimilated. So Zionism emerged as a response to the suffering of Jews in Eastern Europe and Russia. Please note that it was the Europeans that were responsible for the anti-Semitic discrimination and oppression of Jews, not the Palestinians. That's one. Then, of course, what you had is that you had this movement for freedom and liberation of the suffering Jews, but very different from how other third world countries fought for their national liberation against imperialist powers or against colonizing powers. India fought here, Africa, they fought against this thing, against the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and so on. Zionism from the very beginning had to align itself with an imperialist power.
It's been a long journey, and I think by now Palestinians also should have, or the world should have accepted Israel's as a state and an independent state, and the Arab world should have accepted it long before then what is happening today.
Well, one or two things. Let's not forget that the creation of Israel, which was seen understandably as a rectification of an injustice that was done to Jews for centuries, not by the Palestinians, but by the Europeans, was the very formation of Israel was at the same time a profound injustice to the Palestinians and people living there. Your second point about isn't it time that we should come to accept it? Well, that's not a problem. After all, the leadership of the PLO had accepted, recognized Israel and accepted existence there. But do you know that in the Oslo Accords, the Israeli government never accepted the Palestinian right to their own state?
There are two terminologies which keep tossing around, and for our viewers, since you are an expert on this, would like to you to explain these two terminologies. One is Intifada and the other one is Nakba. How much of a context it has to what is happening today?
The Nakba is a reference to what happened in 1948, the ethnic cleansing and the expulsion of Jews. And you have UN resolutions saying that they should be given the right of return to come back, which they've not got. The Intifada is a term that talks about uprising or people's uprising. So when you have a 56-year occupation since 1967, and you had the Nakba 75, and you have this oppression over such a long period of time, the longest in the last 150 years, you're going to have occasions when the people in the occupied territories rise up, because the relationship is one of an occupier country against an occupied. And I just want to point out to you that the occupied have the right to resist. The occupier does not have the right to continue to impose his occupation. Let me just give you a simple example which everybody in India should be able to understand. The British ruled India and colonized India. Do the Indians who are colonized have the right to resist in peaceful forms and other forms, right? Does Britain have the right to carry out a war or in self-defense against an occupied people?
So I'll just, since you've given that example, and therefore I would ask you, so does this resistance need to be violent?
The point is this thing is that in law, an occupied people or colonized people do have the right to resist with arms, but up to a point. There are certain crucial limits. Exactly. You cannot carry out terrorist acts. Hamas carried out a terrorist act, even though it attacked soldiers and took over some 11 military bases, which is a big shock to that. It killed civilians. It's a terrorist act. And that terrorist act, of course, must be condemned. But then, isn't it interesting that Israel carries out terrorist acts? Indeed, not just terrorist acts. It's carried out terrorist campaigns. That is a series of acts over a very short duration, united by an overall strategy, both before what happened on October 7th and afterwards. It's carrying out a terrorist campaign, but nobody calls it a terrorist campaign because you must use language to cover it up. So you talk about retaliation, you talk about reprisal, you talk about self-defense, and you rely on the media and others to also follow that. When actually, look at the number of civilians killed and all. This is a terrorist act, a terrorist campaign. Let me make it very clear. What Hamas did was wrong and must be strongly condemned. But then you must also condemn, not just whitewash, not just claim this thing here, what Israel has been doing both before and after the Palestinian.
Yes, I mean the killing of the civilians must stop, and yes, as you said, a large part of the world definitely condemns it. Yes, the superpowers are in whatever way they are doing it.
I disagree. I don't think they are doing it. They're whitewashing it and soft-soaping it. That's why they use words like self-defense. That's why they use words like reprisal, retaliation. Yeah? They don't even use the word terrorist to describe what Israel is doing. Isn't that interesting?
You have been a critique of the Abraham Accord by President Donald Trump, and despite it involving the Arab countries like the UAE, which have a very great influence in the region. Do you think it was a disaster from the beginning, of failure, because as we see today, it has yielded no results, and even the Arab world is not united as far as...
No, the Arab world is not united, but you have to make a distinction between Arab governments, and you have to make a distinction between governments generally and the public. Don't be surprised when governments are prepared in the name of their so-called national interests or realpolitik to carry out here. It just indicates that they don't really care that much for the Palestinian people and their suffering. You have any number of governments who had good relations with colonial powers and so on. However, the public in the Arab world, unlike the Iranian governments or the Arab governments, etc., are deeply concerned. And you even find a growing number of young people in Western Europe and the United States, including Jewish voices, becoming more and more concerned about the suffering of the Palestinians. So don't be surprised about the Abraham Accords. I, of course, am opposed to that.
We are seeing a war that is going on for the last 40 days. More than 10,000 civilians in the Gaza Strip have been massacred, if I use the term. And the world is still watching. Do you think we have become immune to the suffering, as you put it, of the Palestinians?
Again, there's a difference between governments and people. So people have seen what has happened, and they have, of course, expressed their deep concern. Governments are not that, I'm giving a generalization, governments are not that concerned.
How do you see the response in India then? And that is what...
Well, in India, you have governments which have, well, the Indian government, for example, has not called for a ceasefire.
Yes.
Right.
They didn't vote. They abstained from voting, and
they had not called for a ceasefire. Yeah. The most immediate thing should be a call for a ceasefire, but they have not.
Do you think that is a worry? That is a worrisome?
Of course, I think that's a very sudden. It's a very sudden. Well, let's understand one thing: that in spite of all this talk about the high growth rate and all, India is a country in which you have a huge number of poor people, and you have also people just above the poverty level and so on. In fact, in absolute terms, India still has the largest number. Okay. What is my point here? Most people in India are concerned about livelihood problems. They are not that concerned about foreign policy issues which are distant from them. The category of people that should be concerned about foreign policy issues will be the relatively better off, or what we call the middle class. In India, 150 million to 200 million perhaps. So the question really is not that the people of India are not this thing here, but why is it that this middle class or this upper middle class, which is at least comfortably off, and like, for example, in the Western countries, foreign policy will be taken up by sections of the middle class, whether it's anti-nuclear, whether it's here. So the question you have to ask is that why is it that within this Indian middle class, there is so little concern and preoccupation?
I understand your concern on that, and I think that's a different point of context and debate. But I'll stick to the government and the role of Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the present crisis. Do you think has he done enough? Because he and Prime Minister Netanyahu share a very cordial relationship, at least on that is how it is portrayed on media.
Let's not just talk about the current BJP government. Let's talk about the UPA government or the Congress government beforehand. 1992, the UPA government establishes full diplomatic relations, right? You have in the late 80s and the early 90s, you have a movement by the PLO, Arafat and others, to let's talk about a two-state solution, right? So Indian government says, fine, we are for a two-state solution here. That two-state solution and the Oslo Accords was a complete fraud. From the next year, 1993 onwards,
And why do you precisely say it was a fraud?
Of course it was a fraud. It was not, I give you a point here. Number one is that while Arafat, in fact, recognized Israel, Israel did not recognize the right, Palestinian right to a state. And in fact, one of the persons, Rabin, who got the Nobel Prize for Peace along with Arafat and Shimon Peres, said it very clearly. They're getting something like a state minus. And from the next day, year onwards, fairly soon, they started expanding. Which is and they made a mockery of any idea of a genuine, meaningful two-state solution. Israel is not a nation that has an army. It's an army with a nation. I'm not just saying because of the military importance. The political importance of the army in Israel, you have 75 years of occupation. No political party which is non-Arab in Israel will seriously question the army. What the Modi government did, if you like, was added a certain element of ideological affinity in a certain sense. Then Modi becomes the first prime minister to go to Israel in 2017, and he spent 3 days there. And for the first time, he dehyphenates and he doesn't go to Ramallah on that visit. Next year in 2018, he goes to Ramallah and he goes there for 3 hours only.
This war that we are seeing right now, where again, thousands of civilians, especially more than 4,000, nearly 5,000 children have been killed. What outcome will this yield? Are we going to see ultimately a two-nation state, two-state nations exist, or is it just going to continue until we see more massacre?
Well, this will continue until such time as Israel decides to stop.
You mean the world is just going to watch and it's not going to force Israel to stop?
Let them even come together to actually demand a ceasefire. And the one country that has the power to ensure that Israel accepts a ceasefire is a country that is not prepared to do that, which is the United States, right? So this is important that other countries raise their voices and elsewhere over here. You've seen that in the Arab world, they have not, those who have signed the Abraham Accord are not pulling out of it. There's been talk about cutting relations, which is not taking place. There's been talk about using the oil weapon, which is also not taking place here. So you can see all that problem there. So we all must demand and put pressure for a ceasefire. But to be realistic, how do we get it? So what's likely to take place is that Israel will go on for some time. And the amazing thing about the Palestinian people is that they continue to resist year after year, generation after generation. Not just the Palestinians within Israel, the Palestinians in the occupied territories, and the Palestinians in the diaspora.
Do you think this is going to continue with so many generations being
It's amazing. It's carried on. And it's carried on. You still have the resistance that's carrying on.
How can India be a part of something more conclusive solution towards this crisis?
India for a long time has not been interested in the Palestinian question. It just carry on doing what it does. Unfortunately for India, although it has ambitions to be a great world power, it's not able to do that. And it will not be able to do that for a very obvious reason, which is understandable even by the real politicers and others. And that is that it cannot even dominate the neighborhood. Why? Because you have Pakistan and China. So forget about becoming a dominant power globally. How are you going to here? You have neighbors who are improving their relations with China as a kind of balancing towards India. I'm just talking real politics. I'm not supporting it or anything like that. But so India is a middle power, and for all its ambitions. And these middle powers are aligned or leaning to one power which are much more important than them. So your Turkey is the middle power, India is the middle power, Indonesia will be a middle power. They are all middle powers, and they have their own desire to have a sphere of influence here. But for India, it's even difficult to get that, and it has a close relationship, not formally a strategic alliance, but a close relationship with the US. I'm getting the impression that when you emphasize the question of global powers, yes, you're still thinking about the great power and how they get it here.
No, I'm talking about global. When I say global powers, I'm talking about whether any of such bodies that we have right now, do they have any more influence, and do we really then, when we talk about, say, a body like United Nations or an Arab League?
But I'm saying to you, this is the big difference. Don't look to these forces to be able to do. You have to have a change in the relationship of forces, which will come from struggles from below, which have a very damaging effect on the governments there. So I gave you the example of what would happen in Israel. Let's look at the United States of America. Why did the United States of America get out of Vietnam?
So, well, I will not go to that, but I want to bring you back because I want to focus how Indians are responding to this situation. And do you think people's voices will be heard by the government, and will the government have any response to this better than what it's doing now?
The only way the government can have that is that if you have from within the middle class and others a stronger resistance towards that, and stronger support for the Palestinian question. And here I must say that our responsibility is to generate awareness so that people get a sense of the profound injustice that is being done to the Palestinian people. And but if you compare India and Indian civil society to other civil societies, there's much more chances of civil society in Western Europe and the United States bringing about some kind of a change within their own countries and their attitude towards their...
Is it also because they are more informed about the situations than Indians are?
It's also because, as I said here, you have to look at the nature of the Indian middle class, or what we call the middle class there. And there you have a much stronger history of, upsurges and democratic struggles of various kinds here. Yeah. And here you had on foreign policy issues, which are so distant from most people. It's much less the case over here. I wish I could be more optimistic about the Indian situation. We'll continue to try to inform people so that they understand the injustice. But I am more optimistic about the public, massive public in the Arab countries and elsewhere in terms of what resistance and pressure they can put. So
with that optimism, if I ask for the very last question of our interaction today, what is that one expectation that you have from Indian civil society and at the middle class that you're putting it, so to say, which can, I don't know how far be influenced, but then at least have the awareness, what you just
Let me put it this way to you all. Don't separate the question of fighting against injustice abroad from the question of how strong one's democracy is within your own country. The two are strongly connected. The struggle for greater democracy means that you have much more capacity to actually carry out protests for much more greater information and all that over there. So the question is, and that really means that the struggle for justice in Palestine gets connected to the struggle for justice within countries. I gave you the Arab example. The Arab governments are saying what they're saying now, bending to pressure because of pressure from below. So here, the struggle to raise awareness about the injustice of Palestine is part of a larger struggle, both domestically and internationally, for fighting against various injustices, the caste system, this, that, communalism, all that here, and to generate a much greater and stronger democracy. And the reverse also holds. The weaker that happens there, then that also has its effects domestically. So, I mean, that is one thing. And I will always and is that the struggle for justice is an open-ended one. The struggle for justice for the Palestinians is a longer-term issue. But as I pointed out, Israel cannot do what the first generation of others did. And I am a little bit optimistic because when I look at how the United States and Russia, two most powerful countries, are in such a mess, and the Chinese are not going to be able to get very far also with what they're doing here. Why? And let me end, if you like, by this here. Let's understand what political conflict is all about. Political conflict is not above all a contest of arms. It is not above all a contest of economic strength. It is a contest of wills in which one side seeks to impose its will on the other side. And its military strength and its economic strength are the means by which it seeks to do so. However, what happens if that will to resist is so wide and so deep that they will never give up? How do you think decolonization took place? Is it because India was economically and militarily stronger than Britain? Do you think the countries in Africa were militarily and economically stronger than the Portuguese or the Dutch or the French? The will to resist and to sustain yourself and say, we will keep on fighting until you say, that is where you have, and that's the explanation for how the United States and Russia politically lost, although they were economically and militarily much stronger. Don't underestimate, and please do not become like our so-called strategic experts who have a kind of crude additive conception of power, national comprehensive power. It's this plus this plus this plus this. Economic strength, political strength, smart power, soft power, blah, blah, blah here. They forget the relational aspect with people. And that's how things can change. It's open-ended. It can happen, but we have to fight on various fronts for justice. Ecological issue, for strengthening democracy, against pandemics, against nuclear weapons, and for justice. And all I can say is that, please, don't complicate the Israel-Palestine issue. You don't have to know a great deal, etc. This is like the South African situation. So simple, so clear-cut as to who are the victimizers and who are the victims. All you have to have is to understand that you do not have to be a leftist, you do not have to be a liberal, you do not have to be a Muslim to recognize the justice of the Palestinian cause. You only have to have a basic sense of decency and humanity, and to say, not in my name, there are certain issues that we can all support, that I am not simply an Indian, I'm a universal human being, and in the name of universal humanism, I can say that I support the black struggle against white apartheid. I can support the struggle of women against men. I can support the struggle of lower castes against upper castes. You don't have to be imprisoned with one particular identity. You can do that.
Thank you, Professor Achin, for that, and we shall end it on that note where more awareness and amongst the Indians across the nation will make a difference for the democracy and probably have some influence on others who are having us, who are struggling in their own democracies. We only hope that the war ends sooner than later and the number of lives that are being lost stops here and now. Thank you once again on behalf of Herald TV. I thank you for joining us on this interaction. And you viewers, I hope you have had an insight into the Palestine-Israel crisis. As he has put it, is a situation between the victim and the victimizer. We only hope, and hope is the everlasting thing that we have in front of us, that this present crisis, wherein thousands of civilians, not for their fault, have been massacred, ends and ends soon. Thank you for watching Herald TV.